Hello, welcome to another episode of Gaby's Cheating Stories. Today's story is about love, ambition, betrayal, and the consequences of choices. It follows the lives of Michael and Dorothy, a couple who've been together for 3 years, but have yet to take the next step into marriage. Michael, a 29-year-old entrepreneur, is pouring his heart and soul into building his cleaning business from the ground up. Dorothy, 25, is a passionate dance instructor who teaches students in her home. Their relationship, once filled with dreams and promises, begins to crack under the weight of unmet expectations and external temptations. As Dorothy questions their future and Michael becomes consumed by his work, a handsome divorced father named Rick enters the picture, complicating everything. This tale explores the fragility of trust, the allure of instant gratification, and the harsh reality that sometimes love isn't enough to keep two people together. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Michael first saw Dorothy. He had been walking through the park, lost in thought about his struggling cleaning business. At 26, he had left a stable job to chase his dream of entrepreneurship. But the road was far rougher than he had anticipated. As he passed a small gazebo, he heard laughter, light, melodic, and infectious. Curious, he turned his head and saw her. Dorothy was teaching a group of children how to dance, her movements fluid and graceful, her smile radiant. Michael stood there, captivated. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Without thinking, he approached her after the class and struck up a conversation. Dorothy, amused by his awkward charm, agreed to let him join her next session. What started as a casual encounter soon became a weekly ritual. Michael wasn't a natural dancer, but he was determined, and Dorothy admired his persistence. Over time, their conversations grew deeper, and they discovered a shared passion for building something meaningful in their lives. Little did they know, this chance meeting would change everything. As weeks turned into months, Michael and Dorothy grew closer. They spent countless hours talking about their dreams. Michael's vision of a successful cleaning business and Dorothy's desire to expand her dance academy. They became each other's biggest cheerleaders. Michael would often stay late after Dorothy's classes, helping her rearrange the studio or brainstorming ways to attract more students. In return, Dorothy encouraged Michael when his business faced setbacks, reminding him that every great venture takes time. Their bond deepened, and it wasn't long before they realized they had fallen in love. One evening, after a particularly challenging day for Michael, Dorothy took his hand and told him she believed in him. That moment solidified their relationship. They were a team, united by love and ambition. For a while, it seemed like nothing could tear them apart. 3 years into their relationship, cracks began to form. Michael's cleaning business was still struggling to turn a profit, and he was working longer hours than ever. Dorothy, now 25, started to feel the weight of their stagnant life. She loved Michael, but she couldn't ignore the growing doubts in her mind. Why hadn't he proposed? When would they start building the life she had envisioned? Dorothy began to vocalize her frustrations, often bringing up money and the things they couldn't afford. Michael, exhausted and stressed, tried to reassure her that things would get better, but his words felt empty. Dorothy couldn't help but compare their life to the seemingly perfect lives of her friends, who were getting married, buying homes, and traveling. She started to wonder if she was wasting her time waiting for Michael to figure things out. Enter Rick, the handsome divorced father of one of Dorothy's students. He was charming, confident, and always impeccably dressed. Rick made a point of arriving early to pick up his daughter, often staying to chat with Dorothy. Their conversations were light and flirtatious, and Dorothy couldn't deny the spark she felt whenever he was around. Rick, for his part, was clearly interested in her. He would compliment her dancing, ask about her dreams, and share stories about his own life. Dorothy found herself looking forward to his visits, even though she knew it was wrong. Michael, oblivious to the growing connection between Dorothy and Rick, remained focused on his business. He trusted Dorothy completely, never suspecting that their relationship was in jeopardy. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day, Dorothy agreed to have dinner with Rick. Michael was working late, as usual, and Dorothy was feeling lonely and neglected. The dinner started innocently enough, but as the night wore on, the wine flowed and the conversation grew more intimate. Before she knew it, Dorothy found herself in Rick's arms. The next morning, she woke up filled with guilt but also a strange sense of exhilaration. Rick had made her feel desired in a way Michael hadn't in a long time. She tried to push the incident out of her mind, but it was impossible. She was drawn to Rick in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't long before their affair became a regular occurrence. Dorothy's guilt gnawed at her, but she couldn't bring herself to end things with Rick. He was attentive, charming, and made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, Michael remained oblivious, buried in his work and trusting Dorothy completely. The more time she spent with Rick, the more she began to justify her actions. She told herself that Michael didn't appreciate her, that he was too focused on his business to notice her needs. Rick, on the other hand, seemed to understand her in a way Michael never had. He listened to her dreams, complimented her endlessly, and made her feel like the center of his world. But as the weeks passed, Dorothy began to notice cracks in Rick's perfect facade. He was often vague about his job, and his stories didn't always add up. Still, she pushed her doubts aside, choosing to focus on the way he made her feel. She convinced herself that she deserved this happiness, even if it came at the cost of her relationship with Michael. Deep down, though, she knew she was playing a dangerous game. The guilt and excitement were a constant battle, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the charade. One night, after a particularly passionate evening with Rick, Dorothy returned home to find Michael asleep on the couch, exhausted from another long day at work. She stood there for a moment, watching him, and felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took her breath away. She loved Michael, but she couldn't deny the pull Rick had on her. Torn between two worlds, Dorothy knew she couldn't keep living this double life forever. But for now, she pushed the thought aside, choosing to live in the moment rather than face the consequences of her actions. Months passed, and Dorothy's relationship with Michael continued to deteriorate. She felt torn between her loyalty to Michael and her growing feelings for Rick. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She sat Michael down and told him she wanted to end their relationship. Michael was devastated. He begged her to give him another chance, promising that things would get better. But Dorothy had made up her mind. She told him she needed more stability, more attention, more of a future. Michael, heartbroken, had no choice but to let her go. As Dorothy walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a mistake, but she was too caught up in her emotions to turn back. The days following the breakup were a blur for both of them. Michael threw himself into his work, using it as a distraction from pain. He couldn't understand what had gone wrong. He had always thought they were a team, that they were building a future together. But Dorothy's words echoed in his mind. "I need more." He replayed their conversations, trying to pinpoint the moment things had started to fall apart. Meanwhile, Dorothy tried to convince herself that she had made the right decision. She spent more time with Rick, who was more than happy to fill the void Michael had left. But even as she laughed at his jokes and enjoyed his company, a small part of her wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. For Michael, the pain of losing Dorothy was compounded by the guilt he felt for not being there for her. He replayed their last conversation over and over his mind, wishing he'd said something different, done something more. He started to question everything, his business, his priorities, even his worth as a partner. But as the weeks passed, he began to channel his pain into his work. He landed a major contract that turned his fortunes around, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was on solid ground. Still, the success fell hollow without Dorothy by his side. Dorothy, on the other hand, found herself increasingly disillusioned with Rick. The initial excitement of their affair began to fade, replaced by the reality of who he was. He was charming, yes, but also unreliable and inconsistent. She started to notice little things. The way he avoided talking about his job. The way he always seemed to have an excuse for why he couldn't commit to plans. She tried to ignore the red flags, but they were becoming harder to overlook. And as much as she tried to convince herself that she was happy, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had traded something real for something fleeting. As the weeks turned into months, Dorothy began to realize the gravity of her decision. She had left Michael, the man who had always believed in her, for someone who couldn't even keep his promises. She thought about reaching out to Michael, but pride and guilt held her back. Instead, she threw herself into her dance academy, using her work as a distraction from the mess she had made of her personal life. But no matter how busy she kept herself, she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Dorothy and Rick's relationship started off passionately, but it didn't take long for cracks to show. Rick, it turned out, wasn't the successful businessman he had pretended to be. He was unemployed, living off alimony, and had no real plans for the future. Dorothy, who had always valued stability, quickly grew frustrated. She had left Michael for someone who promised excitement and a better life, but the reality was far from what she had imagined. Rick's charm began to wear thin, and his constant excuses for why he couldn't contribute financially or emotionally started to grate on her. She had traded a man who was building something real for someone who was all talk and no action. Meanwhile, Michael's cleaning business began to thrive. He landed a major contract that turned his fortunes around, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was on solid ground. The success was bittersweet, though. He had always imagined sharing this moment with Dorothy, but now she was gone. He threw himself into his work, using it as a way to numb the pain of losing her. He started to rebuild his life, one step at a time, but the void she had left was still there. He dated casually, but no one could fill the space Dorothy had occupied in his heart. He tried to convince himself that he was better off without her, but deep down, he still wondered what might have been. Dorothy, on the other hand, was struggling to come to terms with the reality of her situation. She had left Michael for Rick, believing that he could offer her the life she wanted. But as the months passed, it became clear that Rick was not the man she had thought he was. He was unreliable, often canceling plans at the last minute or showing up late with flimsy excuses. He was also financially unstable, something Dorothy hadn't fully realized until it was too late. She found herself footing the bill for their dates and even helping him out with small loans, which he always promised to pay back but never did. The more she got to know him, the more she realized that she had made a terrible mistake. The breaking point came one evening when Rick canceled yet another date, claiming he had a business meeting that ran late. Dorothy, fed up, decided to surprise him at his apartment. When she arrived, she found him lounging on the couch, watching TV with beer in hand. There was no business meeting, no urgent matter, just another lie. Dorothy confronted him, and the argument that followed was explosive. Rick accused her of being too demanding, of expecting too much from him. Dorothy, in turn, accused him of being a fraud, of pretending to be someone he wasn't. The fight ended with Dorothy walking out, her heart heavy with regret and anger. As she drove home that night, Dorothy couldn't help but think about Michael. She remembered the way he had always been there for her, the way he had supported her dreams even when his own were falling apart. She thought about the life they could have had together if she had just been patient, if she had believed in him the way he had always believed in her. But it was too late for regrets. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. As she pulled into her driveway, she made a silent promise to herself. She would never again settle for less than she deserved. After 8 months with Rick, Dorothy couldn't take it anymore. The constant lies, the financial instability, and emotional neglect had worn her down. She had left Michael for what she thought was a better life. But the reality was far from what she had imagined. One evening, after yet another argument with Rick, she made the difficult decision to end their relationship. It wasn't a dramatic breakup, just a quiet, resigned conversation where Dorothy told Rick it was over. He didn't fight for her, didn't beg her to stay. He simply shrugged and said, "If that's what you want." His indifference only confirmed what Dorothy already knew. She had wasted her time on someone who didn't truly care about her. In the days that followed, Dorothy found herself reflecting on her choices. She thought about Michael constantly, how he had always been there for her, how he had supported her dreams even when his own were falling apart. She remembered the way he had looked at her, like she was the most important person in the world. She missed that. She missed him, but she wasn't sure if he would ever forgive her for leaving. Still, the thought of reaching out to him lingered in her mind. She told herself it was worth a try, that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other. Meanwhile, Michael's life was moving forward without her. His cleaning business was thriving, and he had finally achieved the stability he had worked so hard for. He had even started dating again, though none of the women he met could compare to Dorothy. He tried to convince himself that he was over her, that he had moved on, but deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. Dorothy had been a part of his life for so long that it felt strange to imagine a future without her. Still, he wasn't sure if he could ever trust her again after she had walked away so easily. When Dorothy finally worked up the courage to reach out to Michael, she was nervous but hopeful. She called him one evening, her heart pounding as she waited for him to answer. When he did, his voice was polite but distant. Dorothy took a deep breath and told him she wanted to talk, that she had made a mistake and wanted to see if they could try again. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Michael finally spoke. "Dorothy," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I've moved on. I wish you the best, but I don't think we're meant to be together anymore." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had expected him to be hesitant, maybe even angry, but she hadn't prepared herself for the possibility that he would reject her outright. The rejection was a wake-up call for Dorothy. She realized that she had taken Michael for granted, assuming he would always be there waiting for her no matter what. But life didn't work that way. People moved on, and sometimes second chances weren't an option. As she hung up the phone, Dorothy felt a mix of emotions, regret, sadness, but also a strange sense of clarity. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. It was time to stop looking for someone else to fix her life and start taking responsibility for herself. Michael continued to focus on his business, which grew exponentially over the next year. He started dating again, meeting women who appreciated his ambition and drive. Dorothy, on the other hand, struggled to rebuild her life. She threw herself into her dance academy, finding solace in her students and her art. Though she still thought about Michael from time to time, she knew she had to let him go. Years later, Michael and Dorothy crossed paths at a charity event. It was one of those coincidences that felt almost too perfect, as if the universe had orchestrated it to force them to confront their past. Michael, now in his early 30s, was dressed in a sharp suit, exuding the confidence of a man who had built something from nothing. Dorothy, elegant in a simple black dress, looked every bit the successful dance instructor she had always dreamed of becoming. When their eyes met across the room, there was a moment of hesitation, a silent acknowledgement of all that had transpired between them. Finally, Michael approached her, a polite smile on his face. "Dorothy," he said, his voice calm but warm, "it's been a while." She smiled back, though her heart was racing. They exchanged pleasantries, talking about their careers and the event they were attending. Dorothy couldn't help but notice how much Michael had changed. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, and there was a sense of peace about him that she hadn't seen in years. She asked about his business, and he told her it was thriving, that he had expanded to multiple locations and was even considering franchising. Dorothy felt a pang of pride for him, mixed with a deep sense of regret. She had been a part of his journey once, but she had walked away when things got tough. Dorothy shared her own successes, telling him about her dance academy and how it had grown beyond her wildest dreams. She spoke with passion, but there was a hint of sadness in her voice. She had achieved so much, but it had come at a cost. Michael listened intently, nodding and smiling at the right moments, but there was a distance between them that neither could ignore. They had shared so much once, but now they were strangers with a shared history. As the conversation wound down, Michael glanced at his watch and excused himself, saying he had to meet someone. Dorothy nodded, understanding that their time together was over. As she watched him walk away, Dorothy felt a wave of emotions wash over her. She thought about the life they could have had together, the dreams they had shared, and the mistakes they had made. She realized that sometimes love isn't enough. It takes trust, patience, and a shared vision to build a life together. She had learned the hard way that chasing instant gratification often leads to long-term regret. And Michael, he had learned that sometimes losing something or someone can be the catalyst for finding something even better. He had built a life he was proud of, one that was no longer defined by the pain of their breakup. In the months that followed, Dorothy threw herself into her work, finding solace in her students and her art. She dated occasionally, but she was no longer in a rush to find the one. She had learned to value herself, to prioritize her own happiness rather than relying on someone else to provide it. Michael, on the other hand, continued to thrive in his business and his personal life. He was engaged to a woman who shared his vision for the future, someone who appreciated his ambition and drive. They were building a life together, one that was rooted in mutual respect and understanding. The story of Michael and Dorothy serves as a reminder that love, while powerful, is only one piece of the puzzle. True happiness comes from within, and sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that shape us the most. Dorothy had learned to let go of the past and embrace the present, while Michael had learned to open his heart again after it had been broken. Their paths had diverged, but both had found a sense of peace and fulfillment. As they moved forward in their separate lives, they carried with them the lessons they had learned, knowing that their story, though imperfect, had shaped them into the people they were meant to be.